Welcome to the Dr. Broadway Podcast, the musical theater history podcast where a couple of doctors sit around and talk about Broadway. I'm your co-host, Dr. Kristin Stultz Pressley, joined as always by Dr. Tracey Brent-Chessum. It's been a minute since I've said that, so pardon me for screwing it up. You would think it would just roll real naturally off the tongue.
It usually does.
I know. Apparently, I've had a little too much holiday over the last couple of months. But at any rate, Tracey Brent-Chessum, today we're joined by a couple more doctors. So I want to welcome Dr. Emily Green and Dr. Michael DeWatley to the Dr. Broadway Podcast. Tracey, tell our listeners what today's seminar episode is going to cover.
So we're talking today about the cost of Broadway. And actually, so I know that I said this on the podcast. I went to the Astor conference in November and gave a paper on basically how we are overproducing musical theater majors for the market. And I was paired in a working group with one Dr. Emily Green and met her and read the paper that she and Michael had written. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is what we've been talking about. And this makes so much sense. I remember very, very early last season, we started saying, I don't know why are these musicals all starting in the West End and then coming to Broadway? This makes no sense whatsoever. And I, read their paper and found my answer. So we're going to talk a little bit about the funding of Broadway and kind of what are things that we don't think about when we think about kind of how Broadway is funded. We tend to look at things and say, oh, it's ticket sales in, and that's what they make, and that's how everything gets taken care of. I'm like, but it's not really that simple. So we're very excited to have Michael and Emily with us today. And why don't I just turn it over to you guys? Can you tell us a little bit about what you do, and then we'll dive into talking about Broadway funding. Michael, why don't you go ahead and go first?
Sure. Thank you very much. So I am a postdoctoral research fellow at SMU Data Arts in Gender in the Arts. So my work right now is primarily concerned with the effects of how we understand gender in artistic pursuit. I'm working on a study right now about caregiving responsibilities in the arts. But that is sort of separate from this project that Emily and I kind of stumbled into together, which I'll let her introduce that part. Emily, do you want to go next?
Sure. So Michael and I were at UT Austin together. We both got our PhDs in the same program. All my cats making an appearance. Benedict Cumbercat also wants to be a doctor. And our dissertation research didn't overlap, but we started talking about things that interested both of us, sort of related to our research. So my dissertation research was focused on digital theater and spectatorship and how spectators were experiencing sort of this influx of digital theater that we've had after the pandemic. But you can look in the UK, and it started even before that, more so than it did here. And Michael was writing very sort of broadly about like nonprofit arts, like management and leadership. But we were both interested in theater and sort of contemporary American theater system, in particular Broadway, and just started talking about why was it, right, that we have so many, like for me, it started with pro shots being recorded in London of London-based productions of shows that started in the US. And we sort of like stumbled into this project together of taking a look at what were the reasons for that. And so Michael has much more expertise than I do sort of on the finance side of it. And he was interested in this program called Theater Tax Relief that we talk a lot about in the paper that we wrote that was started in the UK. And then, magic was born. We just sort of keep talking about things that we're both interested in, and then find a way to make that research.
Yeah, I think key to the conversation is the understanding that post-COVID, the costs for producing musicals everywhere globally have skyrocketed. Just the general cost of inflation a term that we'll talk about, I'm sure, called cost disease, the idea that in the performing arts in particular, your expenses often outpace inflation. So when inflation is really high, then the costs of doing business in the performing arts go even higher, even faster. But one thing that we noticed that was interesting is that the costs have increased unequally between the United States and Great Britain. And as a result, it was shifting the generative locus. Our particular interest is on emerging new musicals, that a lot of new musicals are being workshop developed and premiered with their first class productions, that is, productions with union casts, are happening in the UK and then coming over here, which is the focus of the paper.
This is something that has come up over and over and over again on this podcast. Not that we knew anything that you were working on until this paper, which is so illuminating, but we have obviously noted the exorbitant jump in the cost of producing a Broadway musical. But we've also noted how frequently, we did an episode on Back to the Future, which did its development process in the UK and had no idea why. I had no idea that this
culturally that doesn't make sense.
Right. It just right. No. It doesn't make
Why?
sense. It doesn't
that
make
makes
sense.
No sense.
Well, it makes no sense. But so this is really going to fill in a major gap in the conversations that Tracey and I have been having since we started this podcast. And before I go any further, though, I do want to just say, because this feels like such a removal from what we typically do on the Dr. Broadway podcast, which is take a deep dive into a particular musical. That's why we talk about cost of production. That's why we talk about where it was developed. And what Tracey and I have decided to do is, before we really get rolling with our season 3, where we'll pick back that same way of doing things, pick it back up, we wanted to have a series of podcast episodes that we're calling seminars, in keeping with the education theme, where we can have conversations like this, where Tracey found this great paper at this conference that she went to, and we can talk with these writers about what they've learned, and it's going to enhance our own conversations in kind of what's the bread and butter of the Dr. Broadway podcast, which is those show-specific episodes. This is going to fill in some gaps for us there. Other conversations that we'll have as part of the seminar series we'll talk with a dramaturg about the process of dramaturgy. We'll talk with a writer who's just written a new book about Stephen Sondheim. So we've got lots of exciting things coming up in the seminar series, but to our regular listeners, understand this is not necessarily, we're not changing what we typically do. We're just adding to that, because we think that can present a fuller picture of the development of a Broadway musical, which is what we do. So having said that, that's what this seminar series is all about. And Emily and Michael are so kind to be our first guest as part of this series to talk to us about, the things that we have been saying. Cost of Broadway is exorbitant, and all these shows are starting to be developed in London. What in the world is going on?
and I think that was what was so interesting about your paper is I was, I think I'm looking at page 3 right now, and the thing that caught me more than anything was a line from this paper where they say, noting 46 musicals that opened on Broadway since the COVID lockdowns, only 3 have recouped their investments. Only 3 out of 46. And you go on to kind of talk about how productions in New York cost way more than their counterparts in London. Can you guys tag team a little bit and talk about why they are more expensive in New York than they are in London for us?
Emily, would you like to start, or do you want me to jump in?
I can maybe get it started a little bit. There is another piece that I'm becoming more and more interested in that we didn't completely get into in this paper, which is like really looking at a line by line sort of budget analysis. But they're basically at every turn, things cost more. So your sort of like performers, actors, stage managers, like any of your AEA folks are going to cost more because the wages are higher. The materials are going to cost a little bit more. The space itself, that's the theater itself, that's a piece that for me is still like a question of figuring out, right, exactly what the difference is. Because in a lot of the conversations, right, sort of like producers want to push it onto, right, these union negotiations and like, oh, we just can't
Hmm.
afford to like pay you more. We can't afford to cover your health care. Oh, what a big cost. But like in the broader cost, like that line item is not actually the largest one. But there's a
Hmm.
unique thing I think Mike will be able to talk more about in looking at the difference between like the same musical, like what it costs to put it up in London versus bringing it over to the US, even after it's like been developed and they're just doing a transfer. I think Michael talked a little bit to John Bath about I think Sunset Boulevard in particular and the different.
Mm.
Yeah, so I'll happily share some of that. And also just to say that I have not seen any detailed evidence-based analysis of why these shows are getting more expensive. Like I would be really interested if the Broadway League or other investors would open up their budgets and really do a line-by-line comparison of what pre-COVID expenses were, what post-COVID expenses were, and what is costing more. If you read the New York Times or look at some of the other people who are writing about this extensively, they'll tell you that it's what Emily said, sort of general inflation, increased material costs, higher rents, because Broadway it's a real estate problem as much as
Yeah.
anything else. That you have somewhere in the neighborhood of 46 Broadway theaters, and that's it. So there was a glut of shows that were waiting to be produced during the pandemic lockdown period, and when they needed to go back into theaters, there was to some extent an opportunity to raise the rents higher. And I think some of that happened. And it's also tricky because a lot of the people who were renting out the theaters are also investors on the shows. So when the shows make their money back, the same people who are charging rent are getting paid a little bit twice. Um,
I mean, there's also if you talk about COVID, just how much like after COVID hits and theater is shut down for a very long period of time, it makes sense to me that we're raising prices on things like theaters and stuff because for a year and a half they haven't been able to make any money, right? Like that
yeah.
makes sense to try to help recoup some costs so that they stay solvent, even though we had relief provided by the government, even so some of that was there. They still weren't able to give back to their investors. And so even if they're trying to recover, what's funny when you do that in capitalistic systems is that you increase the price and they never come back down. So that's another, I think, part of
Yeah.
the conversation.
No, so some of it's interesting how the justification for higher costs also varies depending on the interests of the person you're talking to. So when
Huh.
we interviewed like producers and general managers, they would say, "Oh, well, your tickets are cost more because our budgets are higher because of labor unions." And when you talk to, representatives from labor unions, they would tell you that it's higher because of rent and because of all the reasons
Hmm.
that it might be higher. And so there's a little bit of like it's probably a little bit of all these things happening at the same time. And also, like a lot of people would lay the blame actually at the New York City musical theater production tax credit, which is something we'll also talk about a little bit because of the way that whenever there is government money injected into a system, people want a little slice of that pie,
Hmm.
is how like some of them have phrased it in our conversation. But
So
to go
tell
back
us about
to what,
that. Sorry.
Yeah.
yeah, no,
And 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 and
sorry, go
maybe the
ahead,
place
Kristen.
to start, the musical theater tax credit is, it came after London's, I want to get it right. Is it theater tax credit or TTR?
Yeah,
Theater
theater
tax
tax
So
relief.
relief.
theater
Yeah.
tax relief. So this was all new to me. This was all new to me. So start with that. I believe that program in the UK started in 2013, and
Hmm.
then we start to see its impact in 2014. But theater makers in the UK are getting enormous amounts of tax relief to the tune now of 45%.
Hmm.
45%, which is mind blowing. But start with kind of the genesis of this idea in 2013 in the UK, because what happens in the US is a reaction, it seems, to what's happening in the UK. So let's start with the UK.
Sure, yeah. So in the fall of 2013, the theater tax relief program is officially announced. And this is actually on the tail end of similar relief programs that went into effect for other creative sectors in the UK, like video games and film. Theater was kind of seen as like this homegrown creative industry that didn't need a lot of government support. Theater advocates were saying, no, we really need that money actually more than a lot of the other people who are in these other fields do.
Yeah.
Can we please get it? So when it started in 2014, it was at a lower rate. So you could apply 80% of qualifying expenses, that is, any expenses incurred in the UK or in the European Union at the time. After Brexit, it becomes just the UK. 20 to 25% of your qualifying expenditures, which tend to be 80% of your total budget, is the max there. So this is kind of confusing math, but it's 20 to 25% of 80% of your total budget, assuming that you spent all of your money in the European Union or the UK. There's no limit on that at all. So if you spent $100 million or if you spent $20 million, there's no cap. It's all based on the percentage of the money that you spent. After COVID, they decided to boost the rates even higher. So you get to 40 or 45% of qualifying expenses, depending on whether or not your production tours. And the definition of a tour could be a couple of different stops within the UK or within the European Union, which is one of the reasons why there has been a spike also in shows that tour around the UK and then end up with a residency in the West.
So we were finding that too. That's hilarious because we were like, I don't know why it's opening in Manchester right? And then moving to, okay, this makes a little bit more sense.
See how this is unlocking so much. This conversation is so important because it really is a key to unlock so much of so many of the questions Tracey and I have had.
I'm like, I don't know why it's starting in Manchester. I mean, they like theater, but like that doesn't make, it was like, it was very funny. Yeah, that makes more sense now, doesn't it? So it has to tour, and then they can get 45% of 80% of their budget as long as they did it well.
Let me clarify this. Is that money available to any theater maker in any level of professionalism? Do you have to be a quote-unquote professional, or are these monies available to just, a community theater group in Manchester, since we brought it up?
They are available across the board. So they're available to nonprofit theater companies and they're available to individual commercial producing companies, which is one of the differences that we'll talk about when we talk about the differences between what's happening in the UK and what's happening in New York, because they're substantially different programs, even though they're inspired by each other. But it's maybe helpful. I'm using a lot of math here, but it's maybe helpful to give an example. So let's say that there is a show out there that has total expenses of $14 million and $10 million of that was incurred in the UK. It made $8 million in ticket sales, which means that total you made $8 million, you spent 14, you've lost 6, right? You've lost $6 million. But if you can go through this tax credit program, according to the UK government's Creative Industry Tax Relief Calculator, you get $3.2 million back. So instead of losing $6 million, you only lose 2.8. It cushions the blow. There's no total loss scenario. Even if your show doesn't sell a single dollar in tickets, you're making a substantial amount of your original investment back.
Mm-hmm. And it's not like they're just handing money out. This is a tax credit, right? So it's like basically they're just not handing as much of the money over in taxes, and they're able to keep more in their coffers instead of sending a check off like at every night going, this all goes to taxes and this goes to the government. A lot of that gets kept.
That's true, but it can also take the form of a check from the government to the producing companies. So a different scenario, let's say that you actually made money on your show. Total expenses of, say, $10 million, $8 million is the core expense, ticket sales of $12 million. So you've made $2 million on your show, but this is about what you've spent to get to that point. So the tax bill that you might have paid was $400,000, but instead of paying that to the government actually sends you a check back for $2.16 million. So instead of paying taxes, you get a bunch back. And it actually applies for multiple years for royalties. So if you're a director or a creative person working in the UK, you can actually get multiple checks back if your show is running for multiple years based on this tax relief program that you wouldn't get in the United States.
So it's not just startup funds. It's basically like each year, some of this can be applied for just based on how much money you're giving to that playwright or how much money that's crazy. That's insane. I mean,
it's very advantageous.
Amen. Yeah. I thank you, Parliament, but my goodness.
This is so different. Okay, so we know about the TTR, as it's called in the UK, and then much later, several years later, down the road, the U.S. or New York in particular responds in kind with monies from New York State. So it's not the U.S. government; it's from the state.
It's just New York.
Yeah.
And wait, so before we move on,
Yeah.
in the UK, this is a program that is still in place.
Yep.
Okay.
In perpetuity. There is no real threat of this program going away. They actually tried. So I mentioned that the rates went from 20 to 25% to 40 to 45% as part of a post-pandemic boost. So they wanted to lower those rates back down in 2023, and there was a mini revolt. So there were a number of producers,
Good.
like the Society of London Theatre said, we have producers who are saying they're going to produce 20% less shows if you lower the rates back down. We need these rates to stay higher, and so they did in perpetuity. So it's there for a long time.
Awesome. All right, so now let's
is
talk
incredible.
about let's
let's
talk
hear
about New York.
What did New York do in response? Emily, you want to kick us off there and tell us in response to what's happening in the UK, New York says, oh, wait a minute, better do something. What do they do and when?
Sure. I am gonna kick this back to Michael because this
Okay.
tax section of the paper is the section where he really knows the detail.
Understood.
More so.
Understood.
Thanks, Emily. So the New York City Musical and Theatrical Production Tax Credit was launched as a post-COVID relief effort. So the idea of this tax credit was always that it was going to be temporary and that the reason it exists isn't to compete with the UK program, it's to get theaters reopening after COVID. They were
so many
worried.
weren't going to open because they were like,
Right.
how we haven't worked in a year and a half. Like, we have no money to
Yeah.
open this show. That's insane.
And also the very legitimate fear about like our audience is ready to come back, like who's
Right.
going to take the first steps back into the pool. And so the New York State said, here's what we can do to sort of incentivize you to get things going again so that we can rejuvenate our tourism business, get everything back post COVID. So the program launches much later. TTR started in 2014. New York City's program started in 2021. It is at the lower rates. So we're talking about 20 to 25% reimbursement of your operating expenses. Not that it really matters because there's a maximum cap. So musicals, that's what we're primarily interested in, right? Musicals have a cap where you can only get $3 million at most for your Broadway musical from this particular tax credit. Whereas the UK program, like I mentioned before, no cap whatsoever. So it's all based on the amount of money you spent. So the amount of relief can be substantially more, especially as costs have continued to rise. And the New York City program only applies to for-profit entities. So this was very controversial at the time that the program was announced. There was a big article in the New York Times by Paulson and Root that was saying, like, why does The Lion King need $3 million from New York State to reopen? Why does Wicked need that? Why does Phantom of the Opera need that?
But the public theater doesn't get
Right.
anything. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're the
So-
ones
and
that
that-
are sending everything to Broadway. That's interesting.
Yeah, they sure are. And one of the things that we found out in the course of this investigation a little bit is that not-for-profit theater companies are activating for-profit arms so that they can get this tax relief money.
Yeah.
So they are finding a way around that if you're a big institutional company that's regularly producing on Broadway, but it's a different threshold than if you're in the UK. Yeah.
But isn't this complicated because aren't the monies gone in New York? Isn't the fund depleted, right?
Maybe. So
Okay.
so in 2025, New York announced, the state announced that it was running out of money and that it wasn't going to be able to support any productions opening later than September 14th. Then they changed the deadline to December because what they're doing is trying to anticipate. They don't want to promise money to organizations that they can't then offer it to. So they're basing it off of the amount of money that they have. It's also worth knowing that this program was originally funded at $150 million. And it has gotten more. It's gotten 450 million total. And it's still running out because of how expensive Broadway is. And also there's just, there's a limit. So it's maybe going to be
And so
extended again
But it's
this year.
capped at $3 million per show. So I mean, at 450 million, we're talking about like several hundred shows that have asked for this and received. That's
Yeah, and
that's a
the
lot of
thunder of it-
shows, and we only have 6 theaters on Broadway. That's a lot of shows. that
Well,
are
it's not.
asking. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's not just for Broadway musicals; it's also for Broadway straight plays, off Broadway shows. I think can also appeal to this. So there are a lot of
Okay.
different people asking for that money.
Okay, but here's a confusing piece. So, we've talked about the two different programs and how they are drastically different. But in looking at the paper, another piece that comes out is the difference in production costs. So you're looking at specifically there. You mentioned Hadestown, but also Sunset Boulevard. So for purposes of this part of the conversation, I'm just going to mention Sunset Boulevard, which was produced in the West End for £2.5 million in 2023, which is roughly $3.38 million. And every listener to this podcast knows how much I appreciate a reciprocal calculator that tells you
She can't stop herself.
The inflation calculator
is your
my
favorite
best friend. It is my best friend. But so that production, let's just deal in US dollars, $3.38 million. Of course, that's a very famous production, which transferred to Broadway, and it cost $13.5 million to produce. That way outpaces, just the currency exchange, right? So that's another piece of this conversation. Yeah, I can understand why a show would want to, we've talked about Back to the Future. Devil Wears Prada is another one that has played London, and God only knows if it'll ever make it to Broadway. There are others. You mentioned Hadestown in the paper and Sunset Boulevard and others, but that's the piece of the puzzle now that's so confusing. Why is it so much more? Yeah, they get more money back because of this great program in the UK that we cannot create here in the US. But why is there such a discrepancy in the cost of development beyond that? Emily, do you have anything? Do you think? Your thoughts? That's the great mystery, right?
Yeah, this is the part where the budgets remain a little bit of a black box in terms of exactly what is adding up to that 13.5 million. And that's sort of on the lower end, or not the non-exorbitant end of like cost to bring a show to Broadway in the last couple of
seasons. And that particular production is pretty minimalist in comparison to others,
Yes.
Yeah,
so
it's very, because we've been talking about 20 million
understand.
as like the bottom, rung.
Yes, I think like what could cost $13.5 million with this like sparse set?
She's wearing a black slip.
Yeah, like what is
that it?
Yeah, no, I think that is a good question, and I think that's the piece that is interesting to me, that I'm like trying to find like a definitive answer to, because it can't be that materials are that much more expensive, or that actors or stage managers are that much more expensive. So my inkling is it has to do with the real estate piece or like the other pieces, but exactly what is happening there is not. I don't think we've.
I also
discovered
wondered if
it
it was
yet.
like, because we don't have access to those. There's no reason for a for-profit company to be transparent, as we are seeing with, what is it? The Cabaret is being sued by its investors right now because they're not being transparent with their books.
Which, by the way, is a show that started in London and went gangbusters in London.
And then came here, and they have made $90 million, but they can't pay back their investors
They can't
20.
recoup.
Yes,
And so that's
the next piece that also I think for me, for any person, is hard to understand. Like, how can you gross 90 million total? How can you gross? I think Sunset Boulevard was like somewhere in the range of like 60 million, and not make back this.
So the running costs are significantly more, obviously. So it's like, okay, so rental, real estate, I do think that, you're on something there. Then there was like, I don't know, we had a conversation at one point going, is this an insurance thing? Is this like the big narrative seems to be equity. Equity is driving up rates and blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, is it really driving it up? Like, but 13
$10 million.
I'm like,
fivefold. No.
Like I just kind of go, okay, so when somebody does that and then tries to blame it on one group, I see a scapegoat. Because one of the things that I found in my paper was that audiences are growing. Not only on Broadway have they come back to pre-pandemic levels. They are continuing to grow, and they are paying the higher prices. So the audience is now, if you believe, the Broadway League, they are bigger, paying higher prices than they were before the, before the pandemic. So there's a disconnect there. So either these prices have to be so astronomical that like they cannot be overcome, or there's more to the story in there, isn't there? Like maybe it's insurance, maybe it's this, maybe it's that, but it's like, what kind of cut are we taking? Is like, what is happening here? Because this doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I think you can also look at those cases where the landlord is also the investor, right? And maybe on the investment side, they're not making their investment back, but they sure are making money off of
Interesting.
the weekly rent.
Interesting. Well, and you also have to ask, it's like, because if it really is real estate, at what point would Broadway completely break down, and would we just be like, well, we're not doing it on Broadway, we're just going to go out on tour. Like, that's all we're doing now. Not going to do this at all because we can actually make some money on tour. But we don't necessarily see
that trend too. We've seen that trend too. Like,
but it isn't like
saying, I'm gonna end sooner. I'm gonna close sooner on Broadway because I can make more money on the road.
Or like, oh gosh, what is it? Beetlejuice, who starts a touring company and brings it to Broadway for 6 weeks and then takes it off. But it's like, it's like, obviously we don't see the backlash to Broadway so big, but we are starting to see early signs almost that it's like we can't produce here anymore.
Yeah, so that brings me to my next question for either one of you, Michael or Emily, to get your thoughts on this. What are the outcomes of this, right? We've got one thing that jumped out at me in the paper is something that I've been talking about in my talks for years about how the cost is so high to produce a musical that producers are not willing to take a risk on new material, right? That's why we're getting jukebox musicals. That's why we're getting adaptations of films. That's why we're getting revivals, which revivals were always a part of the landscape. But that's why we're going with theatrical comfort food, right? Because producers don't want to take a risk. So, what are the outcomes of these exorbitant costs? What are the outcomes of a lot, not necessarily all, but a lot of things moving to London? I mean, I guess this is a two-part question.
We got to talk about pro shots,
Yeah, we got to get to pro shots and talk about digital theater piece, which is unbelievable. But what are the outcomes of these the issues that you bring up in your paper? What do you think?
What's
I
happen?
think like there
tell us, we're all ears.
Yeah, well, like the core difference starts, particularly from this funding piece of the UK government has expressed like an express interest explicitly in supporting culture and supporting the development of culture and its accessibility to folks, like not just within the UK, but around the world.
Wait a minute. Wait. We don't have that here in America?
I know. Yeah. Yeah. Can you imagine?
I'm
But it's
laughing.
funny,
I'm
'cause
sorry.
we're like, oh, it's so wild. Like the government is giving so much money. I'm like, yeah, that's what it's like to live in a place where the government is interested in actually like developing arts and culture for the people.
Well, and just to give this quote from the paper, in 2014, when the Theater Tax Relief Initiative was seen as a way of, quote, promoting British culture and the way the UK is viewed internationally.
Yes, they're very explicit about their interest in culture as soft power, essentially, in a way that we can see the US like doing the exact inverse of. Like we were so interested, right, in the 50s and the 60s.
Yeah.
Creating this like cultural diplomacy that we now have right, the opposite interest in, that other countries still recognize the value of. As well as like sort of like an intrinsic value of like, like culture for culture's sake, but also sort of promoting that both right within the
American
UK and around the world. Yeah.
American values, American ideas, all those things were used as those cultural diplomats that went all around the world. And now UK is going, hey, we haven't had a lot of representation, and this is a way for us to do that. And that is, But that's masterful. Like, if you go back and look at the history of the United States and how much from Sousa, from John Philip Sousa, all the way through the 60s, you know, we dumped money into sending our cultural products out to do propaganda for us. And it incredibly impacts our relationships, our diplomacy, all sorts of, I mean, there are documented books about this ad nauseum. So it's like, we know that works. So when you see the UK doing that, that's, you know, that's what they're trying to do. And already us as scholars are taking note, and we're all going, wait a minute, something different is happening here, because we're getting them all from Britain. We're getting all the pro shots from Britain. We're getting all of the stuff that used to be housed in our backyard. And it's happening there now. And we have to start then asking ourselves, so if we allow that cultural nexus point, if we allow that to be taken and put in Britain, if we're going to just lease it all to them because we're not going to keep up, what happens to Broadway?
And Tracey, this is another, I cannot believe how relevant this paper is when you pull out all
I told
the pieces.
you. Am I right? I came back and I called her on the phone and I'm like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh.
You did. And as I read it, I mean, you can see my copy is all
like,
marked
okay,
up here.
Okay.
But it is a conversation that we've had over and over and over again too, about this, you know, this competition, unspoken competition, although at some points overtly spoken competition between the US and the UK for dominance in this arena, right? And it seems like the US is just kind of, well, I won't say US because it's not the US, it's not apples to apples. It's not the federal government versus the federal government, right? That's just not the way our structure is set up here.
Yeah, it doesn't quite work that way.
But it feels like we're just kind of in this country rolling over and saying, okay, take it again, right? What really made the hair on the back of my neck stand up was the quote by Andrew Lloyd Webber, where he said that when they made the 40 to 45% tax credit permanent, Andrew Lloyd Webber described it as a, quote, once in a generation transformational change that will ensure Britain remains the global capital of creativity. And to any American theater maker who can read that and not think, wait a minute, this is ours. I don't get it. What do we do? How do we, you know, like I don't know. I don't know. I just feel like there should be more this is completely opinion based, but it feels like if the musical is ours, then it should stay. We should fight a little harder to keep it, right? Right.
Absolutely. And speaking of Andrew Lloyd Webber quotes, one thing that he told the New York Times fairly recently is that Broadway, quote, Broadway is not a business anymore, end quote. So I think what Broadway has going for it, according to people like Andrew Lloyd Webber, who, you know, knows what he's talking about a little bit, is it's still seen, I think, as the like final stamp of legitimacy.
Yeah.
If your musical is well critically received in New York, that carries a lot more weight if you intend to launch an international tour, set up different stops along the way, than it might if it was a West End only musical. Though, and I'm excited to get to the pro shot piece of this too, because distribution of recorded musicals is, I think, increasingly important in future life for these productions that goes well beyond the West End Broadway divide.
It's like if you need that stamp on your production from Broadway, and you know, like, you're not going to get cautious investors to invest in that because the statistics are so bad. Like, do not give money to Broadway shows because it will be bad. Don't do that. But if you need that stamp of approval, the way to get it is to do kind of what Six did, or to do, what some of these other guys did was, make sure that the pro shot gets out before you even get there. And
as long as it's good.
As long as it's good. I mean, the Diana one,
you
like,
can't
I remember
pull Diana.
Yeah,
I wrote about Diana, and it worked in the opposite way.
I love that our brains were thinking the same thing. Like, I saw that and I went, oh no.
Yeah.
Oh no,
yes.
we have a moment. We have a problem. But like, but that's what they're trying to do, right? To get it, in some ways, to get it to Broadway, to see if we have the backing, the wide ranging supports, because legitimately we have a much better way of like categorizing and figuring out numbers of people who've watched a pro shot than we do really about how many people have seen the show or listened to a recording. Like, we don't, like, as far as kind of like numbers, who's consuming this, it's a little easier to quantify one over the other. And so it's like, it would be a better thing to bring to investors and say, no, this is actually going to cover its costs. Like, we'll actually get there. But I wonder how hard it is to kind of drum up that money, and why so many people are fleeing. But
so let's talk about that. Michael and Emily, if y'all can tell us about, as you talk about in the paper, about not only is the British government putting their money where their mouth is in terms of these tax credits, but there's also incentive to have a digital platform. And the digital piece is enormously important. So talk to us about how they're incentivized and what that even looks like, because that's something that we don't have really anything that would be analogous here in the US, at least not to the same degree that they have there.
Sure, yeah. So this is like a couple things are happening in tandem. First is that they started putting money, like tax initiatives, like to develop digital recording infrastructure, like much earlier than well, we haven't yet. So it's infinitely earlier now. But around like a decade or so ago, like circa the time that theater tax relief was developing, actually, they started like codifying some of these things in their tax initiatives for primarily like subsidized organizations. So not the for-profit organizations, but often these in Britain, places like the National Theatre that are very heavily subsidized. They are not commercial ventures, but also are very much a part of like the West
national,
End,
yeah.
landscape, if you will, even though like technically they're not commercial ventures. But you see, right, National Theatre Live, like starts even before this gets like codified in sort of like their tax policy. But they start developing these programs and also developing resources for all sorts of arts organizations to develop those skills. How are we doing this? Like funding pilot projects, things like that. So just in general, like more arts funding, and then like specifically funneled toward right, digital initiatives. And it's also, if you're getting a certain amount of money from the government, you're required to have a digital plan to develop these things. And again, this is part of the piece of wanting to make culture more accessible, both to people inside their country and beyond. It's sort of like one
forward
piece.
thinking.
Yes.
What a
And
crazy idea.
As we know so much, I've taught classes in arts education, and we know we in this country are very aware of the impact that arts education has and can have. And yet in the UK, they really seem to be putting the money behind embracing that impact, and it makes a huge difference. I taught a class online and used Digital Theater Plus, which I think is probably National Theater related. I'm not sure, but I could put in Greek theater, and it would give me not only productions to show my students, but also a curriculum if I wanted to use it, and a PowerPoint if I wanted to use. I mean, it's unbelievable what these digital platforms that they're demanding as part of, you get X amount of money, you have to have this presence.
And on each slide, it says the National Theatre funded by the government of the United Kingdom. It's
really astounding to think of the impact that has. Again, if you want to be the global capital of creativity, as Angel Lloyd Webber put it, they are putting their money where their mouth is.
Very forward thinking.
So there's that piece, and there's also the piece where it is just cheaper to produce digital recordings in London, not like only because of this digital theater initiative, but then we are in a place where it is largely driven by labor and material costs, more so than the rents of the real estate or other pieces. because like union wages are higher in the US than in the UK, and we have sometimes sort of like stricter rules around, right, how many hours you're allowed to work in a day or when does overtime kick in, those sorts of things. And so it is, I talked to someone and they estimated that it's around like 30-ish% more expensive to film in the US because of the film unions, right? Because of the film labor on its own, in addition to any sort of like negotiations you would need to do, or like in addition to the acting labor or the other
Yeah.
labor, things like that.
Because equity
Um,
has really strict rules about when you can
yes.
photograph and when you can videotape and like you have to, I think you said this in the paper, is that you have to actually like negotiate with each individual actor
Yes.
as well as the production. Like that's
Yeah, well, the
crazy. That's
production
a
has to
lot.
negotiate on its own. All the members of the creative team have to negotiate
I,
because the union structure is different.
yeah.
So AEA like only covers stage work, like live stage work, and then we
Yeah.
have SAG-AFTRA that covers everything, right, that might be filmed. Whereas in the UK, British Equity, it covers all of it. Part of that
Yes.
is because when it was founded, it was like sort of founded after in the 30s, after, the talkies were a thing.
Uh-huh.
Right. And so from the beginning, it covered everything. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's like the contract structures are already there. Like they're already being like written in to contracts from the beginning, whereas that's not a thing that we're doing here. So then you sort of have to start from the beginning, right? And then
Because our
equity,
union is
yes.
separated.
And then equity and
Interesting.
SAG have to like have a little like convo, and they were like playing nice for a while over the pandemic, but it's was always sort of explicitly forbidden to in the stated rules, right, that you'd have to like negotiate to film for the purposes of putting a show on a paid streaming service.
Yeah.
Um,
I have two more things that I want to highlight, and one of them, Emily, is something you taught me. Could you talk a little bit about the historical role? I think this is relevant that PBS has played in recording American
uh,
musicals.
Yes, please. Please do that. Please
yeah,
do
yeah, yeah,
that.
yeah. So almost the main driver of any what we would call pro shots before 2000, maybe even before 2005, is because of PBS and because of it started as a series called American Playhouse, sort of in the
Hmm.
70s, and then the Great Performances. Like that is where pro shots of American-based productions were happening, like because of these like PBS series, not for any other reason, for a long, quite some time.
Yeah.
They were like the only game in town, and now PBS is like, ooh, where she's going, goodbye. Um,
But the thing is that you realize for those great performances, you just have a handful of them. They were big time
yeah,
things. If you grew up in the 80s, that was something really, really cool to watch because you could actually see it as it was done on stage a lot of times. And they'd make a huge deal out of it and do their like funding, their call bank funding around in the
hmm,
commercials and everything. I remember because it was bringing something that most people couldn't access to them, and people flocked to it. But it's not like we had hundreds of these things. We don't have a record of that in our country. We have, as Kristin will tell you, it's like we've got critics reports of it, but we don't really have that, But the ones we do
Accessibility.
have is,
Accessibility is an issue.
yeah, really, really, really does come from PBS. It's crazy.
Well, but even trying to get access to a lot of those great performances, which are unbelievable and so fun to find. It a lot of those are VHS. You can get some
Yeah,
of them on
now,
DVD. But they don't. They're locked up tightly. And then the other alternative would be to get the Billy Rose Theater Collection at the New York
yeah,
Public Library for Performing Arts, which are not, those are not meant for public consumption. But
you have to
again,
go there and watch it.
yeah,
Yeah.
accessibility is a major issue with those. You have to have a reason to watch those, and like
hmm,
verify who you are. And why you're watching them. So accessibility is a big issue. That doesn't sound. The UK seems to be circumventing that accessibility issue by making everything digital.
Yeah.
yeah. Well, there's another piece because like the National Theater, right, has this like NT Live series, if you will, where they're like
Mm-hmm.
regularly, right, like putting out, like broadcasting to theaters, but then it's also available on their site, like on a digital platform, all of their shows. And that works because they have a regular season, right, that's like regularly churning through. And on these Broadway theaters, right, we
It's
don't
true.
see that. It's like
That's true.
you film it there, and if it's gone, it- goodbye forever. Like it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
make sense for it to be tied to like a theater, because you're
Mm-hmm.
not going to be able to make multiple recordings because you have this one show until it's done. And then often, right, in the case of, or what happens sometimes, like in the case of Hadestown, they were reportedly very close to filming a pro shot there of the original Broadway production in
Mm-hmm.
2020. It didn't happen because contract negotiations fell apart in a way that I don't know the details of because no one will talk about it. But
Because
then
they're
they
not allowed
decided,
to, right? It's all the
yeah,
NDAs
yeah,
and. But didn't it fall apart like a week
weeks.
before it was supposed to
Yeah,
happen? Like everything was moving in that direction, then it just all imploded for some
yeah.
reason. It,
Yes, yeah.
hmm.
And the exact reason has never been sort of like publicly reported. I certainly don't know it. The person I talked to with direct knowledge of it would not, I
Would
don't know
not
if
tell
they
you.
actually knew, but they certainly wouldn't tell me specifically.
Mm,
But they were involved more on the production side, like the filming side, as opposed to the other side. So they also might not know.
yeah.
Um, but then you see, right in 2025, they decide, you know what, we're going to actually remount a whole new production. It's more cost effective now, right, to make a production, right, rehire all these
In the UK.
in the UK.
So that's why Hadestown has always been here. It started in on Broadway and now it's going to the UK and doing a new production over there so
Mhm.
that they can film it.
Yeah, I mean that might have been an extra bonus, right? They might have done the UK production anyway.
Yeah.
But certainly the reason that, Reeve Carney and like Eva and Patrick Page like went over
Yeah.
there is for this, yeah, for that
That's
reason.
insane.
And Hadestown is actually the show that sort of brought me and Emily into this conversation together because it originally started as a DIY theater project in Vermont,
Yeah,
then
it
took a
did.
trip up to Canada, then a trip over to the National Theater in London, and then over to Broadway, with a stop at the New York Theater Workshop in between. So it's actually a really good example of a lot of these forces coming into play simultaneously, where it gets a big burst of commercial investment in the UK before it comes over to Broadway, before it goes back over to the West End to film.
Mm. So why is it more expensive on the labor side to film here than it is in London? Because we see lots of the pro shots happening there. I mean, Disney filmed
Basically does all theirs there.
they do all of theirs there, and I'm like, what are they just not paying
They have
the
their own
UK
theater here.
actors? Like, well, but I know I just always kind of laugh because I'm like, okay, so are we not paying the actors in the West End as much? Or I'm like, wouldn't they have a problem with that? I like that doesn't make sense. Like, what is really the crux of the issue here?
Yeah, well, Disney actually does a lot of their like development productions over in the
Mm-hmm.
UK and Europe now, just in general. Uh, but also it is like the film crew, like it's more expensive to pay those folks in the US, in addition to any like renegotiating or like payment of the actors. As well as if you're often, right, you have to shut down your show for some period of time, right? Ideally, like a week to do all the like camera blocking and all the things. And that's if your tickets are more expensive here, then that's a higher cost as well.
Mm,
So you're paying the people to like literally the camera people, right? They cost more, their wages are higher over here. And
I
there's
think a
just
huge
more incidental costs. Sorry.
yeah.
No, I was going to say a huge piece of this too. A few months ago, the orchestral musicians for Broadway shows almost went on strike. Actors almost went on strike at the same time. The reason for both of those near strikes was the same, and it was healthcare. So if you're
Yeah.
producing in a country that actually has a universal healthcare system that isn't necessarily attached to employment, then suddenly your negotiations with unions, the costs that you incur are very different.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Part of the reason, right, that wages need to be higher, I think, is the healthcare piece is this important piece because unions have to ensure that they're right or support their workers being able to have access to health insurance, which is something that, we are paying for here, often out of pocket in a way that in the UK they don't have to. So that's one of the drivers, right, of wages being higher because they have to support more of, right, the everyday cost of living here as opposed to the UK.
So I know that nobody has a crystal ball, but I wonder if Michael and Emily, just as we kind of wrap things up, I wonder if you could look into the future, what you kind of predict might happen. And we know that nobody knows for sure, but you guys seem to have your fingers on the pulse of these situations that Tracey and I have noticed at a very high level, not in the weeds like y'all have been. What do you see coming down the pike? Emily, I'll start with you, and then Michael will wrap up with you. Tell us what do you think happens next? How does this play out? How would you predict this might play out, understanding that nobody knows for sure?
It can be an if or that. Like,
don't.
Yeah, I'm trying to wrangle some optimism because I'm not feeling. I think today I'm not feeling very optimistic about the path, because I think in order to change the direction or change the flow of the shift going over to the UK, it will require altruistic decisions, or not primarily financially based decisions, on the part of sort of key investors, real estate holders, right, producers, to make an active decision to develop things in the US, right, or to film these recordings in the US that don't necessarily make the same financial sense that it does to develop in London. Because if we go on the same path, I just see like a similar shift happening, like more and more of the generation and development and recording and distribution of new musicals will shift over to the UK. So I think often like the audiences don't know where something was developed necessarily. I mean, some of us do, right? Like, but many of them don't and don't necessarily care.
What difference does it
And
make,
and
right?
people can go, like, can cross the pond, as it were, much more easily now, right? So even we were seeing a lot of like US based, right, or other, folks from other countries, like going over to London to develop a thing, right? It doesn't have to physically stay here anymore. Um,
And
so
that's
yeah, I
happening in
think
lots of sectors too, right? I mean,
yes,
it's like it's cheaper to go to Tokyo Disney, like, and fly yourself there for a week to do, a family vacation there than it is to actually, do it in Orlando.
yes,
Or all of the people who literally got on a plane to the UK to see the Eras tour. And it was less than it would cost a ticket here. Now, there are lots of other factors that fit into that, but that is very much kind of what it looks like it's headed for. At least when it comes to like theater, it's like we're going to get into the same kind of financial
And
issue.
I think in general, right, the US is becoming a less and less safe place to be, not just for the people who live here, but right, in particular for people who might travel from other places to be here. So Broadway is a tourist spot, I think, is also, right, maybe in danger in that way, as people, right, if it costs more to come here and they're more worried about what could happen to them while they're here. I think that's not great for the future of Broadway. So
So what would
yeah,
we need to do? What would we need to do to put American musical theater and its home Broadway back into its place of preeminence? What would we need to do that?
I think Emily's word was perfect when she said altruism. And I don't think that exists in the producing model that exists in the US.
Well, that doesn't exist in capitalism.
Right. right.
We talk about that a lot, right?
Right. It's just, that word really sticks out with me. It's got to be producers who are in it not just for the sake of making money at it, but are in it for the sake of, again, to borrow Angela Lloyd Webber's phrase, the to be the global capital of creativity, right? Or the quote from the Minister of Culture that I shared from the paper earlier about how it is I can't find it, but it was, promoting British culture and the way the UK is viewed internationally. We need producers to care about that in the US, and that requires an altruism that I don't know that exists. here?
I
What
think
do you
there
think, Michael?
Oh,
Sorry.
I was going to say, I was going to turn to a different word, which also capitalism is not very fond of, which is regulation. So I think like part of the reason why tickets for things like Broadway shows and the Eras tour, to use that example too, is that the secondary market for tickets has gone absolutely insane.
Oh
And there are
yeah,
lots,
no doubt.
and there are lots of for-profit brokers with really unhelpful intentions who drive up the cost of tickets even
Yep.
more than they are, which is giving permission to a lot of investors to raise their ticket, the base level of tickets even higher than they were before, which is pricing a lot of people out of the Broadway
Mm-hmm.
experience.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say regulate the secondary market as a policy push. And also, a lot of the people that we talked to about theater tax relief said that the reason why theater tax relief was able to be sort of openly funded is because they believed that the money that was used for theater tax relief came from a tax that exists on West End tickets that does not exist for Broadway tickets.
Mm.
So I know it's incredibly unpopular to take this thing that everybody needs to be cheaper and say we actually need to make it more expensive with a tax. But what's happening in the UK is it incredibly successful shows that are selling, bucket loads of tickets. The taxes for those tickets are being used to support the generation of new musical theater and musicals that are more experimental and more risky. And it
Mm.
sort of evens things out a little bit. And so I think kind of what needs to happen is the Broadway ticket prices need to become lower before you can make them more expensive. But I do feel like regulation policy shifts have a big role to play in creating an ongoing tax credit that the UK has and the US currently doesn't.
To your
Mm-hmm.
point, I think those are some really tangible ways to fix it, and I love that. I looked up today. I knew that Back to the Future had only run for about, like I said, it was developed primarily in the UK, which is crazy because it's such an American piece of work. That the film, anyway, and it has American creators, but it was developed in the UK and for reasons I didn't understand until I read your paper. And it premiered on Broadway and ran for like a year and a half. It's run for 5 years. It's still running in the UK. It's supposed to, I just checked this morning. It closes in April of 2026 and it will have run for 5 years. So that's a case study that shows. Now granted, some shows just hit differently in different places and we know that too. Things that we think will go one place doesn't and vice versa. But that is a case study in, what you're saying, right? How they're able, the UK, they're able to facilitate an atmosphere that can allow for a longer run. That we
Well, it's an
can't.
interesting cultural question about like, is this show that's being made for and with British audiences, does the comedy change? Even though it's based on an American film, like are the
Mm-hmm.
things about that show that really
Mm-hmm.
strike a chord with British audiences going to translate the same way? And maybe it does, and maybe it doesn't. But by then you're out of time and you're out of money. So I don't
Yeah,
know.
yeah,
There's a lot of talk about that. It's like how they, like, this is the British version and this is the US version. And they know that they're like, okay, this isn't going to land, so we got to trade that. But you're right, we don't see a lot of kind of scholarship on that quite yet. I think it's coming, very much so. And I think you guys need to write the book
yeah. I was going to say,
on
keep
how this
going.
gets.
Keep going.
Well, it's like you're looking at this and you're saying, look, here are all the different things. Like, here's what we would have to do. Here's what we would have to do to make it back to that preeminent place. Because if we don't do this, I think anyone who has been raised in our society and understands American capitalism will know, like, this is not long. this is not going to last that long. So,
And I wonder if in your research, as you've written and prepared for this paper, have you come across any American theater makers, culture makers who seem to be willing to lead this charge for change?
Emily's face right now is, oh my gosh.
I'll take that as a no.
So many of them are working in both places, right? And it's just like,
Right.
oh, I'm working more over here now than I am
Yeah,
over here.
yeah. That makes
Particularly when you're
sense.
talking about like the producer investor level,
Right.
like Lin-Manuel Miranda, like get your theater Avengers together, like and
Yeah.
start moving. I don't, I think it will
Yeah.
take a sort of a project of some key people to really like make a push to shift the tides, but it's tricky because, so there are what, like three organizations that own basically all of the
That's
Yeah.
right.
Broadway theaters, and
That's right.
I think that is for me a place where it's like really important, but also the hardest to see how it could change.
Yeah. I want to wrap up in respect of your time, but I wonder if either of you have parting thoughts that you'd like to share.
I'll start and just say that we've been talking a lot about how the rise in West End transfers has been happening, and it is, and that's very real. There's been a 288% increase. It's huge. But still, the majority of the time, a show that goes to Broadway is coming from an out-of-town tryout in the United States. So there's still, I think, a robust network of not-for-profit theater companies, off-Broadway companies who are continuing to make really incredible work that shows up on Broadway stages. And I don't mean to discount that or discount their work. It's just that there is like this alternate path that seems very clear to me, if I was a Broadway investor, that it seems to be growing in popularity.
Yeah.
That's a great point. Thank you for making
Shout
that
out
point.
to our nonprofit friends who are doing
Yeah.
the work, besides, even though they don't have the funding.
Right.
know?
And thank you for making that point. We've talked a lot about a lot of those theaters and the great work that they've done. And so I'm glad you made that point. Emily, how about you?
Yeah, I do want to echo that slightly, or like largely. And then I was thinking earlier, but then didn't say, like when this sort of big institution at the top of Broadway starts to not work the same or break down, that creative energy is going to go somewhere, and often it like come filters
Trickles.
out to like different places, right? It's a little bit scrappier. It's, we're doing it in a different place or we're putting it out in a different way, but there is like so much creative energy. I think that like, life will find a way in some way. But I also, I think part of my interest was born. I saw the pro shot of Kinky Boots, which was of the UK production, and I was like, where is Billy Porter? I want Billy Porter, and I want Stark Sands, and what we are capturing are lovely actors, right, from the UK. But I'm thinking about the future, like generations from now, and like when we're like, oh, we're watching the recording of this. Like the Into the Woods recording was so foundational for me and was like such
Yep.
a sort of a fluke. And so that's what I'm thinking about too, is like how can we f find a way to make the archive that we're building of performances sort of reflective of like the originating touchstone
Great point.
moments.
Yeah.
That's a great
Um,
point.
yeah, that's what I'm
That's a
thinking.
great point. Yeah.
Because our actors equity people are going to at some point go, now wait a minute. They're gonna say,
Yeah.
wait a minute, this was made famous by these people
Right.
and they are not in the pro shot. And
Right.
yeah, I think you're right on that. Interesting.
Yeah, that's a great point. Guys, this has been a fascinating conversation. And I truly mean it when I say so many of the things that Tracey and I have kind of scratched our heads over the last year of doing this podcast. I'm like, no, this makes no sense to us. Why is this happening? This has really been so illuminating to so many of those head scratching moments that we've had. Thank you so much for joining us. I am so grateful. I hope you will come back with more research down the road. You are always welcome here. Thank you, Dr. Michael DeWatley, Dr. Emily Green. Thank you so much for being here with us today to discuss this conundrum that we have. We are so grateful. And that'll do it for this episode of the Dr. Broadway podcast. Tune in for our next seminar episode, which will be another topical conversation similar to this one next week. Regular episodes will return in early March. Until then, connect with us via email at hello@drbroadway.com or on Instagram, YouTube, or TikTok at Dr. Bway Podcast.